Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell. And today I want to share with you a brand new talk that I've put together. I'm going to use it as the podcast. I'm presenting this the week of August 4th at a summer camp for the Salvation Army. But I wanted to share it with you first here. It's called Transformations Through the Sea: What God's Victory at the Red Sea Means for a Life of Missional Holiness. And I'm excited about this talk because it brings me back to what I worked on when I was working on my PhD. I wrote on Exodus chapter 15, 1 to 21, and I'm going to draw some insights from my further study on that text, and I hope this serves you really powerfully. I'm excited about this because this is also going to be part of my book on Exodus that will be coming out in the summer of 2026. If you would like to connect with me, you can check out the show notes. Also, I'll leave some resources, including books that I've already written. By the way, if you use those Amazon links, whether or not you buy the books, but go and buy whatever you usually buy, I do get a small kind of royalty payment from Amazon that doesn't cause your prices to change at all for the things that you buy, but it's a way that you can help support the podcast. If you find this helpful, would you please hit like, share it with a friend, and if you're not already, would you subscribe, please? And if you'd like to connect with me, you can always go to brianrussellphd.com. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I do hope to begin sending that back out regularly again, or you can just subscribe to the site to get some updates. So let's take a look at the crossing of the Red Sea. Again, this is one of the most familiar stories in the Old Testament. And I want you just to think about what you already have in mind when you think about the Red Sea, whether you've read the text recently. Again, this would be Exodus 13, 17 through 15, 1 to 21. I'm only going to read a little bit of Exodus 15, but we'll be jumping around in the text. You don't necessarily need your Bible, but if you have one handy and you want to follow along, I invite you to do that. But I want to start with a question to frame this. How would you live differently if you knew deep in your mind, deep in your heart, and deep in your body that God truly has your best interests at heart, as well as the interests of those whom you love most? How would you live differently if you knew that God truly has your best interests at heart, as well as the interests of those whom you love most? Well, the Red Sea in the Old Testament is really that act that makes it clear who God is and that God can be trusted. And at the Red Sea, God is going to do two deep things, which we'll get to in a minute. God is going to secure the future, and God is going to defeat death. And the Red Sea miracle, it's what brings the whole book of Exodus to a climax. Because if there isn't the Red Sea miracle, it doesn't really matter that Israel was delivered from Egypt, because they would have been wiped out. Because what we find, and if you read Exodus 13, 17 to 14, 31, you find that Israel is literally trapped on the plains east of Egypt between the waters of the sea and the mighty chariot army of Pharaoh. Again, they've escaped into the wilderness. They've already, if you go back to Exodus from roughly chapter 7 all the way through 13, 16, you get the series of signs that God does that that causes Pharaoh to finally release God's people, with that climactic sign being the Passover. So now God's people march out of Egypt, and they find themselves again to their east, the waters of the Red Sea. And let me say something about the sea. Don't make the mistake of just viewing the water as some mere geographical obstacle. if you go into the weeds on this, scholars debate whether we should translate this the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, but all those conversations really obscure a deeper truth here. The waters blocking in God's people represent chaos. And in ancient mythology, chaos, it's the power of uncreation. Then, as now, bodies of water were dangerous. Water could literally swallow up dry land and human life and just wash it away. Therefore, when we think about the obstacle that Israel faced, the Red Sea, you want to see that as a symbol, not just of something that would have had to cross, but literally a symbol of uncreation. And in fact, in the ancient world, the sea was one of the most feared gods in Western Asia at that time. And this god was known, at least to the Canaanites, as Yam, Y-A-M-M. And Yam, that's the Hebrew word for sea, but Yam was the god of the sea and the river. Yam was the embodiment of watery chaos. If you know Greco-Roman later mythology, this would have been the same god that they would have known as Poseidon or Neptune. And so what Yam did, Yam continually threatened the order of the world by threatening to destroy it. And so the Israelites find themselves pinned in on one side by the power of uncreation. Now, again, what's interesting about this is the Hebrew word for sea is Yam. It's really the same word as this god, and that echoes the name of the sea god that was worshipped by Israel's neighbors. But that doesn't mean that the Hebrews considered the sea to be divine, but it does show the link between some of the mythologies of the peoples around Israel and the Hebrew language itself. And if we even come into the modern world, this doesn't seem so far-fetched to see water as a symbol of uncreation. Because if you just watch the news the last couple of years, we've seen the destructive force of water through, just in 2024, the horrible flooding that happened up in eastern Tennessee in the Appalachian area. We've seen hurricanes batter the west coast of Florida, and even get inland into parts of Georgia. And so we've seen mudslides in Florida, in California. There's tidal waves. Raging waters can literally wipe out civilization as we know it, even in the 21st century. So if waters can at times remain a terrifying threat today, imagine what it would have been like for men and women living during the late Bronze Age, which is when the Exodus would have taken place. Would have either been in the 15th century BC or the 13th century. And in fact, Israel's enslaved during one of the most powerful eras of Egyptian history. Now, what's interesting about this question of sea, there's a scholar named Bernard Bateau, and he suggests an alternative translation. Instead of trying to figure out if it's Red Sea or Reed Sea, he argues that you can translate this the sea of extinction. And whether or not Bateau is right, his translation captures the gravity of what Israel was facing when it had its backs to the sea. Israel could be uncreated by the forces of watery chaos. And I also want you to think about how God's going to bring Israel out of Egypt and then into the Promised Land, because God is going to split the Red Sea, as we know. But it's also interesting, later in Joshua, God also makes a way through the Jordan River. And so when God splits the sea and later kind of dams up the Jordan River, God isn't just doing a really cool miracle. What God is doing is God is directly confronting, subduing, and controlling one of the most powerful forces in the ancient world, the god of chaos. But in the biblical story, chaos doesn't have power, but rather it becomes a tool that God can use as a means of saving his people, whom he called to be his people. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. So that's on one side. You have the god of chaos threatening to uncreate Israel. Now, to their west, Israel faces the mighty chariot army of Pharaoh. Now, there's nothing mythological about a chariot army, but we do want to remember that Pharaoh was not only the most powerful ruler in the biblical world, but at that time he was considered to be a god by the Egyptians. So you have this god leading a mighty chariot army on the other side. Now, God had already sent 10 mighty plagues, as I mentioned, and Pharaoh had given up God's people. But if you read into chapter 14, Pharaoh was bowed but not broken. And the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh decides with strength and a will to go out and pursue and try to recapture, or more likely just kill all the Israelites. Now, when we say that Egypt was the superpower of the era, it would have had a massive army. Exodus 14:6 tells us that Pharaoh unleashed 600 elite chariot units along with his regular chariot units. Now, if in fact the Exodus was in the 13th century, the Pharaoh would have been Ramses II. Now, what's fascinating is if you go probably about 40 years earlier, before the Exodus, Ramses II, in a famous ancient battle at Kadesh, which happened in 1274, Pharaoh fielded a chariot army of approximately 2,000 chariots against the Hittites, who also had a chariot army, and it was one of the largest battles in the ancient world. And so if Ramses really is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the numbers in Exodus aren't exaggerated at all. And so Israel literally might have faced the sight of perhaps 2,000 chariots bearing down on them. And what was a chariot? In the ancient world, chariots were the kind of the force multiplier on the ancient battlefield. And you could think of a chariot as the equivalent maybe of a modern tank or maybe even a fighter jet. On flat terrain, chariots were incredibly mobile, and chariots allowed an army to attack both at speed with devastating power and, if need be, from a distance, because the chariots would have had archers on them that could be launching deadly projectiles out of the range of the opposing infantry. And if you massed a whole bunch of chariots together and charged, they would have induced a terror in any opposing army, and they could simply trample through infantry that was deployed on foot. And think about the Israelites. Again, they're trapped between the chariot army and the Red Sea, and the Israelites weren't trained infantry. Exodus 13:18 mentions that God's people left Egypt prepared for battle, but they were not likely well-trained or even well-armed at all, right? So they're in big trouble. So at most, prepared for battle meant they were marching in some kind of organized fashion. Perhaps they had some kind of makeshift weaponry. God's people faced certain death because even with their large numbers, they were going to be no match for Pharaoh's trained warriors. And so if on one side Israel faced chaos, on the other side, Pharaoh and the forces of Egypt represent death. And so from Exodus 1 to this story in the plains of the sea in Exodus 14, Pharaoh has been focused on the genocide of God's people. And so again, whether it be the waters to the east or the army to the west, God's people faced annihilation. But God's people had the Lord. In Exodus 9:16, God had already told Pharaoh, "But this is why I have let you live, to show you my power and to make my name resound throughout the earth." Pharaoh had attempted a genocide against God's people, and by doing so, Pharaoh had also acted against God's mission to bless all people and all nations through the descendants of Abraham. At the sea, Yahweh, the Lord, would demonstrate once for all who God was and guarantee the future for God's people. And in the process, God would defeat the forces of chaos and death. In Exodus 14:13, God said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. The Lord will fight for you. You only have to keep still." Now, when we read the book of Exodus, and that's just an introduction to what's going on here, when we read the book of Exodus, we want to recognize what's going on here, right? And so what the Red Sea does, what God does at the sea, is God defeats two great fears: chaos and death. Friends, what are you afraid of? We're all afraid of something. And whatever you're afraid of, that is what your God is. And the two great fears are chaos, the idea that somehow our world can just be uncreated. And then the great fear, other fear, is the fear of dying. What if at the Red Sea, God ultimately conquered both of those? Before we go any farther, I want to say, what do we get wrong about the Exodus and the Red Sea? The first thing is this: it isn't just about getting Israel out of Egypt. It's not merely about freedom from slavery. It's about freedom for living for God. And ultimately, what does that look like? It's freedom for missional holiness. And I'm putting those two things. The key central theme of Exodus is God has called his people out of Egypt to be his hands, his feet, his mouthpieces in the world. So if you want to understand Exodus, we need to understand two things. The first thing is a missional insight. God wasn't for Israel against the Egyptians. God was for Israel for the sake of all nations, including the Egyptians. God saved Israel from the Egyptians, ultimately for the sake of the Egyptians. And even we know from the story that a mixed multitude goes with the Israelites. They want to be part of Israel. That's the missional thing. So all the way back to Abraham, all families on earth will be blessed through you. God wasn't for Israel against the nations. God was for Israel for the sake of all nations. And even in the book of Exodus, for the Egyptians. The second key truth: it was easier for God to get Israel out of Egypt ultimately than it was for God to get Egypt out of Israel. God freed Israel for mission and to reflect who God was and to no longer live like the Egyptians did. And so to get back to the story then, to understand what happens at the sea is God won a great victory for God's people. And this is the victory that changes everything. So the first kind of transforming thing that we want to see, the first transformation, is recognizing that the miracle of the sea was a worldview shaping event. It changed everything for Israel in the same way that the resurrection changes everything for the Christ following movement. Without the victory at the sea, the Passover and the escape from Egypt would have been meaningless and short-lived. And just like without the resurrection, Jesus' death would have likely been forgotten or at best admired as some kind of heroic death, rather than a death-defying, salvation-producing event. The resurrection elevated the death of Jesus to being this transcendent, world-altering event. It signaled God's victory over sin, injustice, chaos, and death. And Jesus' resurrection pointed to God's future of peace, love, justice, and righteousness. In the Old Testament, the victory at the sea signaled to God's people full freedom from the power of Egypt and a secure future in the land that God had promised them through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their families. Second thing, the miracle at the sea is a transformation through the experience of God's grace. A little bit later in Exodus 19:4, God's going to say to Moses, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Whenever we read about salvation in the Bible, God does the work. And at the Red Sea, when that sea split and God's people were able to go through it, and the water then came back down upon the Egyptians and they were destroyed, and the sea was just rendered to be a tool, God saved Israel. That's grace. God did the work. And as I'm looking and thinking about the people that are listening to you, I'm curious, what is your story? How's God worked in your life? What's your story? Remember God's grace. And then the second transformation that takes place is there's a transformation through the worship of God's sacred memory. And we see in Exodus 15 that all Israel join together to celebrate God's victory. Exodus 15:1b, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and its chariot driver he has cast into the sea. 2b, this is my God, and I will praise him, the God of my father, so I will exalt him. When we recognize God's grace, we go through ongoing transformation through our worship of God. We sing to the Lord for what God has done. And what's God done for you, friend? And are you worshiping God? Are you remembering those things? And worship is a way of practicing sacred memory of what God's done in the past so that we continue to experience it in the present. I will sing to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and its chariot driver he's cast into the sea. Third thing is there's a transformation about our understanding of who God is. Exodus 15:2a, the Lord is my strength and my refuge. He has become my salvation. So we recognize that the Lord is our Savior. In Isaiah 43, we get, for I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. Exodus 15:3, the Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. You know, Pharaoh back in chapter 4 of chapter 5 of Exodus, it says, who is the Lord that I should listen to him? Pharaoh's not asking that question anymore. He knows the Lord. And the Lord shows up and does what no other God has ever done. God shows up and fights for his people. And what is the name of this God? His name is the Lord. And the Lord will reign forever and ever. So we get this new identity where God is king. And again, as I mentioned, in the ancient world, the god Yam was always trying to uncreate things. And in a sense, by God defeating the forces of death, Egypt, and of uncreation, the sea, that's a declaration to the whole world that the Lord really is the king. And so there's a transformation at the sea that points to the Lord is king. Jesus is King Jesus. The Lord will reign forever and ever. And then there's a transformation through freedom from the powers that hold us captive. And this is super important. We've been talking about fear. And in the ancient world, when we talk about chaos and death, I mentioned Pharaoh was sort of a divine figure. He was kind of the god of death in this story. And already mentioned that the sea would have thought to have been this god of chaos. But what happens in the story? God defeats them. So this gets back to that question of fear, right? Whatever you fear, you tell me what you're afraid of, and I'll tell you who your God really is. Instead, Exodus 15:11 just asks a great question. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, mighty among the holy ones, awe-inspiring in praises, doing wonders? And the answer is no one. By doing what God has done in Exodus, God has proven that there is no other God like God. In fact, there's no reason to even call any other being a God except for the Lord. And so what happens at the sea is there's a transformation of our fears, the very things that we are inclined to be obedient to and to serve and to worship because we're afraid of them. They're all erased, and it's the Lord alone. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? And then that leads to the final transformation, which is the transformation into a holy missional people. And this is the whole point, right? When we experience God's grace. When we worship, when we recognize who God really is, that God's the King, that God fights for us. When we recognize that no other gods have any claim to us, there's no other power that has any claim to us. There's nothing for us if we really sell out to God that we should ever be afraid of. God then invites us to be his special people with a special vocation, and that vocation is to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Exodus 19, 5-6, when God is calling Israel, these are the first words that God speaks over Israel. Indeed, the whole earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And just look at those words there. If you want to know what God's will is for your life tonight, it's this. We're a community, right? This isn't a solitary call on individuals. It talks about a kingdom and a nation. But what kind of kingdom is this? It's a kingdom of priests. And what do priests do? Priests connect people to God. That's mission. So we have community. God calls us to be a new community tonight, a missional community, and a community that's holy, that reflects who God is. That's what happens at the sea. So how do we live that out today? How do we live into that victory? How do we live into that victory that God did for Israel? How do we live into the full implications of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Well, this is really interesting. We always think, well, Jesus, it would have been really easy if we would have been there. But what's fascinating is we have the same resources available to us that God's people had in the Old Testament, as well as what God's people had in the New Testament. And I want you to consider a really interesting verse. This is from Psalm 77. And Psalm 77 has a lot of language from the Exodus in there. And this is a little bit of sacred memory about the Exodus. But this is a peculiar verse. It's talking about the going through the sea. It says, your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters, yet your footprints were unseen. Stop and think about that for a second. Just imagine if you were there. The water opened up, right? But nobody saw God. Do you remember what happened? The only thing that was happening is Moses had and Aaron, they had the rod up in the air, right? And that caused the sea to split. And they told the people what to do. So you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So even when God was at the most spectacular, God wasn't there physically. God, of course, split the sea, but all the people saw was Moses obeying, doing what God had told him to do. And you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And friends, I would suggest to you that we still have Moses and Aaron available to us today, because what does those represent? Moses ultimately represents the scriptures themselves, because Moses lived on, because Moses gave Israel the book that God inspired him to write. And so today we're still led by the hand of Moses. We have the scriptures of the Old Testament and the New Testament to be our guide. And we're also still led by Aaron, because who is Aaron? Aaron was the priest. Aaron was in charge of the worship. And we still have access to worship and prayer and all of the beautiful liturgies that God's people have. So we can avail ourselves of that. So how do we live those things today? As a community, we gather around to study Scripture, to worship God, to be together as the people of God. And so I ask again, I'm going to end this kind of where I started. How would you live differently if you knew deep in your mind, deep in your heart, deep in your body that God truly has your best interests at heart, as well as the best interests of those whom you love the most? But I'm going to caveat. What are you afraid of today, friends? What are you afraid of? I've told the story before, and probably on some podcast episode of a story that happened about 20 years ago when I had taken my children to the beach. It was in the spring, and it was too cold to get in the water, so it was sort of a sandcastle day. And so me and my two daughters, they were very young at the time. We were making sandcastles, and they wanted a little kind of little, they wanted to have a pool of water in the middle of their castle. So we would put water in, but we were too far from the ocean. And so the water kept seeping in. So I told the girls, I was trying to wear them out a little bit too. You know, that's what you do when you're a dad with a young family. You try to wear the kids out so you can sleep at night. So I had the girls run down and get water, and they'd come back and they'd dump it in. And of course the water would seep out and say, go get some more water, girls. And one of the times they went down to the edge to get some water, they started squealing and jumping up and down like little girls that are super excited. And they go, Dad, come down here and look at this. And they found there were these little, they called them little baby seashells. The locals down in Florida call them periwinkles. They're just little tiny seashells. And they kept burrowing themselves in. So the girls were scooping them up, and then they're having fun. And then my oldest daughter looked at me. She was probably 5 or 6 at the time. And she said those words that every father fears. Dad, can we take them home? Now, of course, I don't want to disappoint my daughter, so but there's no. I didn't want to take these home, and I would take care of them. And I said, Michaela, what are we going to put them in? Oh, Dad, we could just put them in a little jar. And I said, Michaela, I want you to turn around and I want you to look and see how big the ocean is. And I said, how big is it? She goes, Dad, the ocean's huge. And I said, okay, so if you're one of these little periwinkles, would you rather go live in this little tiny jar at our house where all you're going to have is whatever's inside the jar? Or would you rather live in that huge ocean, be friends with other seashells that are out there in the water, be able to go wherever the current takes you, maybe even meet Nemo out there in the water? And I thought, okay, and I thought to myself, that's really good. And so what do you want? Do you want to live in a jar, Michaela, or do you want to live in the ocean? She goes, Dad, that's so easy. I'd want to live in the jar. And then I said, why? She goes, Dad, because if I lived in the ocean, I might get eaten by a shark. Friends, what are you really afraid of? What's keeping you in your little jar when God has a huge call on you, because God has shown that he has your best interests at heart? What are you really afraid of? Can you surrender that today? And when you get to the point of that surrender, that's what we're talking about when we talk about holiness. There's a final question. Ask yourself, am I all in? Because that's what the Red Sea is ultimately about, friends. It's about transforming us into a life of missional holiness. And each of us needs to ask ourselves, am I all in? Live by faith, be known by love, be a voice of hope to others. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If I can be of any service, reach out to me, Brian at brianrussellphd.com. I'll see you next time.